We're so happy that you're here today to join us for this professional development learning module on generative AI technology and language instruction, a multilingual learners of English professional learning seminar. We want to begin by thanking our grant partners, Ascendium, the Texas Success Center, Student Ready Strategies, and WestEd. My name is Emelisa, and I will be your moderator today. Our presenters today are Dr. Holly Hassel, who is Professor and Director of Composition at Michigan Tech University, where she trains, supervises, and mentors graduate students in the teaching of writing. Dr. Hassel also has over 2 decades of experience teaching in the two-year college system. She is joined today by Professor Janine Rudnick, who is Professor of English as a Second Language and Speech Communication at El Paso Community College, where she also works as a technology trainer focused on AI and Microsoft.
All right, here are some suggested PD meeting norms. Make equity central, commit to active participation, share talk time and listening for understanding, seek clarification as needed, recognize impact and intent, recognize that everyone has expertise, and in your group, you may have some other norms or revisions.
So we have a few objectives for this professional learning module. First, we hope that you, as a participant, will surface your pedagogical goals and thinking around generative AI technologies. We'll hope you leave having learned about some possible uses of AI for your course. And we hope that you'll also explore some possible approaches for encouraging responsible generative AI use for your students. So we want to take up both some big questions and some practical introduction to different generative AI tools. So just to sort of frame the conversation, we have a few questions that have a lot of different answers depending on your specific pedagogical orientation, depending on your approach to your classroom, to your students, to your institutional context. First, even just the language around what we call Gen AI tools, whether it's Grammarly or ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity, the language itself is sometimes slippery or has different implications. So, because a lot of these are commercially produced, there are some scholars who think it's important to call them products because they're not free of the implications that come with being something that is commercial. Another big concern, of course, for all of us as educators is what kinds of uses of Gen AI technology will inhibit student learning that might contribute to cognitive offloading for particularly important literacy tasks that we want students to engage with, versus what uses are going to support student learning and then help them develop skills. Another big question that's being taken up by scholars and researchers is the question of what, if any, uses are responsible and ethical. There's certainly a spectrum among educators in higher education and in other contexts about to what extent we can incorporate these into our classrooms and provide students with strategies and a kind of ethical apparatus to incorporate them into their learning processes. Um, there's some scholars and researchers who argue that there's really no way to ethically use these technologies because of the impact that they can have on our environment, on people. And so we ask you to kind of think about that context as well. And then last, how do you as an educator balance your concerns about intellectual property, the way that technologies like ChatGPT are being are drawing from online data sets that people who created them may or may not have given permission for them to do so. Some of the labor and environmental issues that are increasingly getting attention, and the ways that generative AI technologies are being integrated, whether we have a choice about it or not, into our workplaces and into our classrooms. And some other questions that we hope that you'll keep thinking about as we're introduced to some of these technologies and some pedagogical strategies to help students use them. How can you, as an instructor, help students make choices among all the different kinds of technologies that are available? There's a depth of knowledge about even how technologies like large language models work that students may not be familiar with or are using them without that understanding. How do you help students develop not just technical proficiency with generative AI literacy, but also a critical orientation to it? So we know that generative AI technology, like Claude or like some of these large language models, can hallucinate. They can provide incorrect information. They can refer to sources that don't exist. They can do math wrong. And so, how do we help students understand and cultivate that, not automatically assuming that some of these Gen I technologies are magic or objective or always correct? And so, thank you. Couple more questions for you to be thinking about as we're going through our session. Which tools do you want to integrate into your classroom activities? There's lots of them. There's lots of choices. We're going to talk about a couple of them today, but certainly we can't cover everything. And then the last, how might I support students who do not want to use generative AI for all of the reasons that we've discussed? That's something I'm increasingly seeing in my student population, in my own kid actually, who have some really strong moral objections to it, and so we want to make sure that those students aren't required to use something or engage in a practice that they really feel is wrong. So we'll keep thinking about how you can make space for that in your classroom as well while we're working going through the session.
All right, today we're going to go through three different things. We're going to present different technologies that can be used by students and instructors. We're going to talk about approaches that build technical skills and critical AI literacy. And then you are going to reflect on possible uses in your classrooms. So, the first thing we're going to look at today is ChatGPT. And I know you might be thinking, I know all about ChatGPT, and I don't want my students to use it because all they're going to do is have it write a paper for them. Well, that can happen, but what we want to do is really channel that information from ChatGPT and tell the students, here's how you can use this to help you. So, what we're going to do today are a couple of things. First, we're going to go to study and learn. That's a separate area of ChatGPT that's relatively new. And then we're also going to look at the voice mode. And that may be something that some people have not looked at also. So let's go ahead and look at how we find these things. What you want to do when you're looking at ChatGPT or your students are looking at ChatGPT is first we're going to go over to the plus sign and then you're going to look at study and learn. Now, keep in mind that technology changes very quickly and your list may have more things on it by the time we look at this, or it may have a little bit of a rearrangement, but we're going to look at study and learn. So when we look at study and learn, it's a little different than just ChatGPT because the question I asked it was, how can I use Cornell Notes? And it will tell me how to use it step by step. It's not going to give me all the information at once, like here's everything you need to know. But then it's going to say, do you want to practice? What do you want to do next? How do you want to learn about it? Should we create something to help you learn? The next thing we want to look at is Chat GPT voice. And let's go ahead and play a clip of what it can be used for. How do you pronounce the ED endings on past tense words?
So the ed ending in past tense verbs has three possible pronunciations. If the verb ends with a voiceless sound like K or P, the ed is pronounced as T, like in walked. If the verb ends in a voiced sound like G or D, the ed is pronounced as D, like in played. And if the verb ends in a T or E sound, then the ed is pronounced as it, like in wanted. Let me know if you like more examples.
All right, the second thing we're going to look at is Grammarly authorship. Now, we've heard of Grammarly, but Grammarly authorship really helps us with that struggle of did this student write this paper? Did this author really write all of this? So we look at a self assessment tool. I don't look at this as something like a gotcha tool that we use, that instructors use, but instead, this is a self assessment that helps students demonstrate where they got their information. It will identify original work or work that's copied from AI or another source. but the writing has to be tracked. That's a key there. The student can get a report showing statistics about how much of the paper was original, how much was copied from certain sources, and then the link can be sent to the instructor. So, this is something that the students can use to verify that they have written their paper, and then the report will show all of the details. So how this works is that there's a little button that is a fingerprint button, and they have to click on that to track their work. If the work isn't tracked, then you're not going to get any of these reports, and then the work will show that information that I talked about earlier. Now, when you click on the report, you're going to see a few things. So this is just a paper that I wrote, and it's a bad paper, but it's a paper that I wanted to show you information for. This will work on Google Docs or it will work on Microsoft Word also. You can see there that I have a certain percentage typed by a human, some copied from a source, and some that is unknown. I have zero unknown. That's because it's all tracked. So what happens is that I can click on something that is purple, which says it is copied from a source. Now here, because I've tracked it, I've got the Chat GPT source at the side. You can also see what was typed by the student or by the individual, and that's in green. So it really shows what is original and what is copied. Now, the other interesting thing using Grammarly authorship is that there's a little button at the bottom that is a play button. Now, this will, as it's tracked, it will record how the information was gathered or what happened. So you can play this at the bottom and you can see what was typed in. It will show you the typing. It will also show you like if a couple paragraphs were just dumped into this paper. So it's a really good source for students to verify that they wrote that information, and it's a good source for you as an instructor to see how they wrote their paper.
We invite you now to pause and reflect. Take a few minutes with your group or on your own to explore the resources you just learned about. These include ChatGPT Study and Learn, ChatGPT Voice, and Grammarly Authorship. Alone or with your group, we invite you to try these ideas. Ask ChatGPT to summarize a topic you are teaching this week. Use ChatGPT Voice for quick answers. Or try a quick writing sample with pasting in Grammarly Authorship.
So, thanks, Janine, for showcasing those tools. Uh, in my own program and my own work, I'm thinking a lot about how we can encourage students to make good choices, right? What can we do to incentivize students to do the right thing, even if they're not, being monitored or they're not, expecting to have somebody check on them. So Grammarly authorship as a tool for students to self-assess is awesome. But I can imagine some teachers might be tempted to use it as a sort of maybe punitively or as a way of sort of supervising, monitoring, policing students. And so another way to encourage students to make good choices about their own composing process is what we're calling in my program a responsible use matrix. And this came out of our own approach to uh, directing students or giving them guidance about generative AI. So a couple of years ago, we created a policy that required essentially accountability and transparency. So students decided to use generative AI for some part of their process. They had to describe it in what we call an author's note, but that some people might call a reflective memo or a writer's statement or something like that. And then over the course of the year, we discovered that one thing that was challenging for students who are new college writers is they don't always have the language to talk about how they used it. And so out of that emerged our responsible use matrix. And the way we're thinking about that, we'll show you an example in just a bit, is that it outlines different parts of a literacy or an academic task process. So it could, it can be writing, it can be reading, it can be translation, it can be an analysis of a sentence even. But it essentially just breaks that process down and then defines what that looks like. What is that task? What are the cognitive steps? What are the composing steps? Then the matrix gives an example of what a responsible use of Grammarly authorship might be, a responsible use of the study and learn tool in ChatGPT, if there is a responsible use for, for AI. And then also would identify an irresponsible use. So, if there are ways in particular that you think that you don't want students to use generative AI for that task, you can give an example of what that looks like. And then last, it explains risks of use. So we want students to understand that we want students to make strategic and specific intentional choices about what they're doing. So the matrix, we created a matrix. We call it a matrix versus a table or a rubric because it is able to demonstrate the intersection of multiple categories or topics, and it isn't really about levels of performance so much as helping students understand different aspects of a task. So this section of the matrix gives an example of of what I was just describing. So we use this for first year writing class, and the matrix identifies different sort of breaks down different stages of the writing and research process. So identifying, what we might call invention, they might call pre-writing or brainstorming. Just giving students that language of what that part of the process is called. Then we have a how and why category, yeah, I guess, heading, that, kind of breaks down what generative AI could do for you in this stage. So maybe, suggest ideas, expands on prompts, ways that you might use that tool, at this stage. A responsible usage might be to expand on ideas, pose questions, run multiple iterations, sort of dialogic. Irresponsible usage, using it to generate your whole topic idea without having some initial ideas first. And then we also wanted to identify, like, why might you not want to do that? You might say I'm stuck, but then you're also missing opportunities to do your own thinking, to get creative, to kind of force yourself to really dig in and think about what you want to write about and why or how. And then we have a second, there's a 8 or 10 different rows that we'll share as part of the resource guide for this specific matrix. But another example would be of reading. So most people know what reading is, but it's actually, there's components of reading, there's steps to reading, right? So might outline, okay, a purpose you might use generative AI is to identify key points. You might use it to unpack or summarize text as part of the research and writing process. Um, or we distinguish between a responsible use. And let me also add that, like, you might not think this is a responsible use. Like, this might not be true for you or your classroom. And so then you can say there isn't one, right? For this, we're talking about in the specific class that we use this for. Students are often reading peer-reviewed scholarly articles, relatively complex, research reports. And so we might say, okay, you might use ChatGPT to create a reading guide for you. So when you're trying to navigate it, that text, it can give you some clues or some guidance. Um, but also just says, an irresponsible usage would be to substitute AI generated summaries for actually reading, because, you know, that's kind of our whole thing. And um, and so, yeah, and then risks of use, helping students understand, like, if you do use it irresponsibly, you're not going to understand your topic. You're not going to understand your sources. You may be misrepresenting it. It might tell you something that's not actually in that text. So this is a couple of examples of how you might outline possible use and irresponsible use and what some risks are. And then there's a few resources here. They'll be included in the resource guide, the discussion guide. These are some documents that were created by the organization, joint organizational task force between the Modern Language Association and the Conference on College Composition and Communication. A series of 3 working papers. They're longer, they're dense. They do take some time to go through, but the goal with them, as I was a co-chair of this group, is to really offer, they're both long and condensed. How about that? Be relatively comprehensive so you could feel like you're getting a pretty expansive understanding of the topic, but not have to read 50 books and 50 articles, right? Is to sort of give that high level overview. And so each of them deal with different issues. One just kind of definitions and principles, the second on policy development, and the third on what does generative AI literacy look like in higher education. And then the other two resources, and we'll look at the second one in a little bit more detail. These are also really good student-facing documents that you can incorporate into your classroom and talk about with students.
We invite you now to pause your video and to reflect, either individually or to take a moment to talk with peers. I know that I have learned so much about these tools, Grammarly and ChatGPT, that I felt like I already understood. But being able to think about them through this new lens of what might they do to serve students, not just what might I need to do to police them, as Holly talked about earlier, I think is really important. So take a moment now to think about the responsible use means. Imagine, perhaps, what it might a similar resource look like for you in your own class or in your own assignments. For example, you might think of a task that you ask students to do in your class, which parts might be aided by Gen AI technology, or which parts might students need to do independently and why. Another question you might consider could be what aspects of your local context influence students' access, experience, and interests in integrating AI tech into their academic experiences. After you've taken a moment to think about these questions or to reflect in a small group, go ahead and resume the video.
All right, welcome back. I hope that you have been able to discuss some things with your colleagues or at least have had a chance to reflect on what we've talked about so far. Now, the last, certainly not the last thing that's out there, but the last thing we're going to talk about today that's really a program or a product or however you want to term it, technology, is Notebook LM. I like Notebook LM. It's my favorite tool, and there are many things that I like about it. First of all, the learners can reference up to 50 different sources, which means you can input or upload up to 50 sources for students to use. That's quite a few sources. And this, by the way, is on the free version of it. Of course, all of these things have a paid version and a free version, and we're just looking at the free version for Notebook LM today. In this Notebook LM, students can review information and ask questions. They can listen to a podcast or they can watch an explainer video. They can get quizzes, vocabulary lists, and briefings about the topic. And they can also make flashcards too. In addition, this notebook can be shared. Now, one thing you want to remember is that just like all of this technology, this gets updated fairly frequently. So there may be things there in a little while that aren't there now. Let's take a look at the one I created for my students, which is grammar. So when I take a look at my grammar notebook, I have added some resources at the side. So I talk about pronunciation errors, I have videos, I have all kinds of things. Now, the interesting thing about Notebook LM is that for the most part, this is self contained. What I mean by that is you can add sources and those sources that you add are what is used for all of the rest of the information, except for this part right here in the middle, which is AI generated. So you still have to be careful when you use the center about finding information, but for the most part, they're using your sources that you want them to answer questions. You're also going to be able to select the sources. Now, I have a lot of different topics in my area about grammar, but I don't always want to use those because it's going to be too much at once. We know that a whole semester won't get us through grammar and everything we need to know about grammar. And it's the same thing here. You may want to create a second notebook for a different type of grammar or different content, or you can put it in and then you're just selecting the things you want to talk about. So for some of these, I'll show you as we go along how I've done things and how I've limited things. All right, first of all, we get kind of an overall summary. And here in the middle, um, this is the AI part where you can start typing and ask any questions that you want. So this is typical of ChatGPT or anything else, except that it's mainly using your documents. So that is a good thing to know that it's using your documents. Now, let's go over to the studio. And the studio has quite a few things that we can do. So let's go through some of these. First of all, I'm just going to go through my list of things I've created. I have selected 5 sources from the left. I'm not using all of them, I'm only using 5. And here I created a quiz, which is right up here. And it will generate a quiz for me. Then the students can take a look at that quiz. I have 11 questions. Again, you want to make sure that these things are correct. And if it's not, you're going to say bad content and you're going to report it. But the students then can get a quiz about the content. This would make things great for them to review. Now, we also have a few other things. Let's take a look at this how to fix run on sentences. And what we're going to do is play it and give you a few more details. Now, this is an explainer video. You can make it larger if you want to, but what it does, it takes some of your content, and again, it's 5 sources that I've selected from the left, and it has created a simple video. So let's take a listen to that.
All right, let's talk about one of the most common tripwires in writing, the run on sentence. Fixing these things isn't just about passing a grammar test, it's really about making your ideas land with way more.
So an explainer video is very simple. It doesn't have a lot of flash. It's not like your Canva or PowerPoint presentation, but it explains everything the student needs to know. And so this can be shared, it can be downloaded, and it can be made bigger so the students can take a look at that. So that's the video overview. Now, in addition to some of the other things here, we have briefing docs, study guides, and that's all under this area called reports. So I can generate reports based on my information. I can create my own kind of report in structure and style. I could do a training manual, a lesson plan that would be useful for all of us who provide these instructions, blog post, study guides. So if you do a study guide or the student takes a look and says, okay, I have 30 sources here, I need to know all of this. How can I study for it? It will give the student a short answer quiz, suggested essay question. It will give them vocabulary terms and things to think about. In addition, they could do a briefing doc. And for some of us, that's going to be a really great tool to be able to take this large document and then have a briefing doc. Now, reading is important, as we mentioned earlier, so we don't want to skip the reading part. But this is something that can help people just to summarize or get the information and maybe a little bit quicker. All right, let's also take a look at something that's called the audio overview. Now, here we are creating information about, in this case, it's fanboys. We love our fanboys, right? So we want to go ahead and open it up. Now, when you're taking a look at a podcast, this is one that I think is fantastic because we are taking our information, and again, we have a certain number of sources that we're using, not everything on our list, unless it all relates, and it's creating a discussion for us. It's 2 people making things a little bit more interesting than they might be. Femboys is, of course, interesting, but maybe not something we would choose to listen to in our spare time. But when we have something like this, we can also interrupt the speaker, which is a crazy thought. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So we're just looking at fanboys and we're unpacking the secret power. So we're going to play the audio and then I'm going to have the ability to interrupt.
You know how sometimes you're reading something, maybe an article, maybe even just an email, and a sentence just it flows perfectly.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, hey there. What's up?
Yeah, I have a question. What does fanboys stand for?
Oh, that's a great question.
We love that you're jumping in.
We were just about to dive right into that acronym.
So the F in fanboy stands for 4.
And 4 is a coordinating conjunction.
It's often used as a more
So we can see that there's a lot of potential in using the audio overview, the video overview, the mind maps, all of the things in Notebook LM help us to create like a self-contained study guide. We of course want the students to read everything, but there are options also that they could listen, or they could get an explainer video, they could get a study guide, they can do all sorts of things. And really, your imagination is what's key to this. What do you want to study? What do you want them to study? You can also share this notebook with them, and they can use it, although they can't add to it when you share that information. So this is a tool that I find to be very useful. And like I mentioned, you can put in any kind of subject, any kind of content material, videos, PDFs, documents, and this is something that will really, really help your students.
Okay, thanks, Janine, for showing us all of those incredible things that Notebook LM can do. Um, as we were discussing earlier with the responsible use matrix and with our big questions, in addition to students being able to benefit as learners and to interact with content in a different way, we also want them to develop that AI literacy, or sometimes we will call it critical AI literacy. I kind of think of we're okay with just AI literacy here as it is outlined in the outcomes guidance document. This is also from the Modern Language Association, and this is a more traditional outcomes style approach in which the student guide includes 7 different outcomes along with some more detailed description of exactly what the skills look like within that outcome. So we're going to take a look at some outcomes that you might incorporate into the activities that we've been demonstrating. So, for example, Janine showed you all of the different ways that students might use Notebook LM for their learning. And then an additional component of an assignment like that might be an outcome that you attach to the activity. So either something that you ask students to jot down a response to really quick, or that they report on it in a class period. But you might incorporate this outcome one, which is from the MLA handout, and the outcome is you, meaning students, monitor your own learning as you use Gen AI tools. And then that specific outcome is broken down into some more specific um, indicators. So, you can understand and articulate why you use Gen AI in a writing, reading, or research task. You can explain how using a Gen AI tool for writing contributed to your work, or for any, whatever kind of activity that you've asked students to experiment with a technology. You can reflect on how your use of Gen AI affects your creativity and development as a writer. And you can reflect on your learning needs and make effective decisions about when to avoid relying on Gen AI as a learning tool. So you might think about if you're having students engage in a study and learn activity with ChatGPT, or you're having them do something with Notebook LM, incorporating this as part of what they then also provide to you as documentation of the activity. Again, this could also be something that is in a whole class discussion, or something that students talk about in small groups after an assignment, to really kind of surface the extent to which they're working toward these.
Yeah, that is really a good point. They do have to monitor their own learning. And that's something we really want to get across to everyone, that it's not just here's a great tool, use it, but is it something that should be used, and how do I use it effectively?
Yeah, exactly. A second outcome might be particularly relevant in the context of this session. You recognize that Gen AI is fundamentally different from human communication, and this can have sort of multiple implications, right? As Janine was mentioning earlier, so many of the Gen AI technologies that exist, chatbots, AI personas, they can seem like real people. Are programmed algorithmically to respond in particular ways to a user. And so on one level, yes, we want students to understand that these are not tools that are operating as a person or like a person. But second, especially with multilingual students, they're going to want to not just know the technology of grammar or of course, right? There's all sorts of ways that you're teaching communication in that kind of class, but there's also a limit to what it is that Notebook LM or ChatGPT can teach them about human communication. And so, of course, with any kind of language instruction, it's more than just the words, the vocabulary, the grammar, right? Janine, I feel
Can
like,
I
yeah,
can I
yeah.
give an
So,
example here?
yeah.
So I am originally from South Dakota, and the
Oh.
capital of South Dakota is pronounced Pierre. It looks like Pierre, but it's Pierre.
Mhm.
And so when I was talking to the audio overview person, it's not a person, but you think it is. When I was talking in Chat GPT and I was doing the voice mode, I said, "What is the capital of South Dakota?" And the answer was Pierre, and I
Mhm.
said, "That's correct, but you pronounce it Pierre." And the machine said, "No, it's Pierre."
Wow, that's a perfect example, right? Of
Yeah,
like a sort of, yeah, the cultural norms, the different,
it
dialects,
doesn't know that.
it doesn't know that. It doesn't know that. And, you could have even more significant issues. Excellent transition. Yeah, it's not real, right? And even if you can communicate with a chatbot in a way that it seems like it's engaging with you, your voice, your concerns, your interests, it's an algorithm. And that can be, especially for um people who are just learning, whether it's young students who are new to a language, students who are new to a culture, like it can be difficult to distinguish between um, these different voices. Obviously, concerns about copyright, intellectual property, all of these are, you may be thinking about these. Some concerns have been raised about, how data are trained. What happens to my information? Like if I put it in a, ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini, and then, coming back to that student who says, I don't, I'm really uncomfortable with this. I don't, all of the possible concerns or critiques they might have. How might you design activities that don't necessarily require use? And you can create, other alternatives. You could, if you're doing something in class, you might say, okay, here's a student who already has an account with this technology. Why don't you, pair up with someone who is not interested in using it or doesn't want to, and you can kind of go through it together and raise some of the questions, have that dialogue. um, you might be able to, you can, if you want students to just understand something about how a technology works, like Janine, showed us, waddled through it, went through a video of it, you can have students view that so that they can understand how it works without necessarily needing to do it themselves. An alternative might be what I did in my own class when I first, fall of 2023, was just created a class account that I just, sort of like a dummy email, and then use that to create an account. I still had to put some of my information in, but then students could use that account for in-class activities. And so they didn't have to provide their own information. So yeah, and then thinking about those other questions around spectrum of where the spectrum of where students and faculty are. Some are really sophisticated, some are really critical, some are not technologically, super literate, and they don't necessarily want to be. Um, some students have a lot of kind of sophisticated experience around rhetorical and genre activities. So just really being aware of that full spectrum of where students are coming from, I think, is important.
We invite you to again pause the video now in order to reflect, either independently or with your group. Something that you might consider could be the technologies introduced in the activities for accountability for students. You might reflect in writing or in discussion with a partner or on your own about your current thinking about generative AI and language instruction. Questions to consider might be: what are the possible benefits to your students' learning? What are the possible limitations? After you've had a moment to think about these things and to reflect, again, either individually or with others in your professional development group, we invite you to continue the video to finish up the rest of the module.
So these are some big questions that we might want to swing back around to. How do we help students develop that literacy?
Yeah, and I would say, we've given some different examples of the matrix or outcomes tools that pedagogical tools, pedagogical activities. I think Jean and I would both agree that a lot of what you need to do as an instructor, as an educator, is making sure that you're always pairing this some kind of generative AI activity with these moments of reflection, with a question that asks them about context or asks them to self-assess about how they used it and why. Um, and,
Well, and really just talking about it, because I think sometimes we just say, "Don't use it," or "You can only use it for this," but we don't even get into the discussion of why. Why is this not responsible, or why is this not ethical? And we
yeah.
just skim over that. So I think talking about it's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for educators themselves, you have to ask, like, what uses are going to inhibit versus support student learning and skill development. You have to ask yourself that. The instructors themselves, I would argue, do need to be aware of how these
Mhm.
technologies work. I know there's some movement toward kind of disengagement or resistance, and I understand people have different levels of comfort. At the same time, these are really ubiquitous in how students are approaching their classes. And so I think if we aren't able to actually understand the mechanics of how they work and the possible uses that students might engage in, it's going to be really hard to guide them around what's responsible, what's
That's
ethical,
true.
what's inhibiting their skill development,
Yeah, we really
versus
can't
helping it.
deny that it's out there.
And then questions again for yourself, what uses are responsible, what uses are ethical. I think going back to a point that Janine made earlier about that most of these tools are tools, they're technologies, they're products, and a lot of these products have paid versions and they have free versions. And so free versions can, you know, be very different in terms of their capacities, in terms of their accuracy, in terms of the robustness of them versus the paid version. So an equity issue can be, well, I have a student with, the $20 monthly subscription to Claude or to ChatGPT. They're getting access to quite a lot more in terms of how that's going to be a tool they can use, even in just the number of queries they can ask a day of it versus the student using the free version. And so we also want to think about that issue of equity.
Finally, we invite you to pause and reflect one more time in order to continue the conversations around these big questions with your professional learning cohort. Take a few minutes to discuss these questions and the other big questions amongst your cohort. Share what excites you about AI, as well as what concerns you might have and other ideas that you might have to mitigate them. Thank you so much for joining us today. We were so pleased to be able to learn from Dr. Holly Hassel and Professor Janine Rudnick as they talked with us about AI and its implications for teaching language in the classroom. Translating Opportunity Texas is a collaborative initiative among the Texas Success Center, Student Ready Strategies, WestEd, and the Center for Community College Student Engagement. The initiative is funded by Ascendium Education Philanthropy, a division of Ascendium Education Group. Copyright 2025, permission granted for unlimited use with appropriate citation.